I am so conservative,
rationalize in my head. These are things I read in
and
the
I'm going to talk about
scriptures.
Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had invited.
Remembered at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah. I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. And welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection. Today, our friend, Dr. David Marshall, I think he's still our friend,
I hope.
joins us to critique a definition and overview of systemic racism. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is the Grievance Industrial Complex, because things are never bad enough already. The Grievance Industrial Complex. Our regular legal disclaimer: our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be David Marshall, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the Webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. This satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Our regular announcements notice: the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy this webcast or it really annoys you and you would like to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And never fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant, so your computer will not explode when you go to our website. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. Greetings. Here's the applause. Okay, for Dr. David Marshall, I am going to we're going to break down and actually get some real applause. Well, it won't be real, but it'll sound like real applause.
Right, it'll be real fake applause.
Real fake applause, yes, because you deserve the very best. Greetings.
Exactly.
Hello, Ron. Did I understand you to say that that David Marshall has no connection to any smart remarks?
Right, because we're trying to give
I'm
you.
I'm feeling a little disrespected here.
I know we're trying to get. Well, we meant by that in another sense, a sense that Don usually he calls me the smart aleck, resident smart guy. I think sometimes
smart guy in
two
ways.
Really, sometimes he means you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, no, we're not trying to impugn your intelligence here. No. But we're trying to give you plausible deniability, so you can say,
right. If you don't like our satire, we kind of developed that for.
I come here for the corny jokes.
So. You come here for the corny
jokes. Well,
so good. Then you've just completely shot your plausible deniability. Now
exactly.
Now they can come after you.
Now they come after you, and so
they can cancel you.
People are offended by our ideas. Well, too bad for them.
And somebody will eventually cancel you. So, but greetings. Greetings.
Good morning.
Yes.
Good morning.
It's afternoon here, and there you go.
But it's morning in America.
We're crossing three time zones today, so.
Yeah, it's morning in America. Thanks to Ronnie.
Well, we're not going to get into this too much, but Roe v. Wade, of course, has brought more chaos into the world of politics to some degree this week.
Might say
and Marxism for the last 3 years has been making a march through the institutions in a pretty interesting and big way, and one of which is kind of the rewriting of history of our nation, which seems to be appropriate that we talk about that today. And
Yeah.
one of the individuals who would stop by pretty much every week for the live webcast and for things we did on YouTube, etc., would continually post on our Facebook page this definition of systemic racism in sociology, written by Nikki Lane Cote, C-O-T-E, or Cote, PhD. So we're going to talk about some of the claims in here to the best of our meager ability. Frankly, I think David has a better grasp on the whole issue of quote, systemic racism, end quote, having actually traveled more countries on the planet than just the U.S. And most of the writers, I have to suggest, have never been outside the borders of the U.S. for other than a short vacation in a vacation spot, which is largely Americanized, so they would have no familiarity with how other cultures actually live. Would that be a reasonable assessment, do you think, David?
Well, I know some things and I don't know some other things. I'm not a sociologist, for better or for worse. Oh, am I? Sorry.
Yeah, we too know some
We can
things.
hear you. We can hear you just fine.
We have a lot in common because we too know some things and don't know other things.
Yes, yes. And I'm not as particularly an expert on Hispanic American society or African American society for that matter, but I do know a lot about cultures in general and something about history as well. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of knowledge, I guess.
Well, and
I
experience.
have a lot of opinions. I have opinions about almost everything also.
Yeah, I have opinions about almost everything too. Some of them are actually well founded, and some of them are just made up. So, and it makes me happy.
But that's your opinion.
Well,
so.
I wrote a book 2 years ago, an ebook called "Letter to a Racist Nation," and that was in the wake of the Black Lives Matter uprising. So I did some research on the subject at the time, and I also put a lot of my own background knowledge about how human cultures work into that. And I noticed that, is her name Cole or Cote? I'm not sure I have her name right.
Oh, Cole.
Cole,
yes. Cole.
Yes. She has a PhD in sociology from UC Santa Barbara. She seems to be fairly young. It seems that a terminal degree in sociology is kind of like a license to preach for a lot of people. Now, personally, I have friends who are sociologists and are very, very smart people, and I respect them deeply. But this article is, I guess you want to talk about Ms. Cole's article. Can you tell me something about the background, how this came up?
Well, yeah, it came up largely because as we were doing a whole variety of topics, there was a Facebook individual who every week, as we're doing webcast, would post this article into our comment sections. He would then post it on our Facebook page, which is fine. We're pretty open to that. We hardly, how do I say this, censor anybody unless it just goes over the top. We're open to discussion. We don't have to agree with you. We do expect, though, what's the word I want to use?
Niceness.
Yeah, we do expect
if only he'd used his evil doctrine for niceness instead of evil.
Yeah, or more to the point, just posting the article is insufficient because I would ask questions about it, and he simply wouldn't respond. He would just go silent. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, that is a kind of a demonstration of someone who actually doesn't really have an argument himself. He's relying on some other professional to do the convincing work. But I think it's important to actually understand what it is that you're perpetrating on others out there and should be able to make some reasonable defense. Well, so that's the background of this article.
It encapsulates a view of race in America that is obviously very popular right now and really It was published, I think, first in July of 2020, which is right
Correct.
after
Yep.
the George Floyd uprising. So it's very derivative. It's not something, that article is, there's nothing very original in it, but in very short form. I checked. The word white is used 38 times in that 1,600 word article.
Okay.
In every case, pretty much as a synonym for the devil. So it may be that the three of us should be having this discussion on Halloween. I'm thinking, instead of in the middle of June.
I bet you the devil's happy about that too, but go ahead.
And the word race, racism, or racist was used 60 times. So those two words together make up a pretty large chunk of the article.
Okay.
I got the impression she's trying to make a point that somehow links being white to racism. I'm just a wild guess there.
Yeah, it's an important article in the sense that it encapsulates what a lot of people think about the history of the United States and the present condition of the United States, and the fact that America is a racist country, systemically racist country, and what that means. She's maybe echoing some other scholars who are maybe a little bit older than her, and she's not doing it. There's no sense of
originality.
Not originality, and also there's no humor in the article.
But that's a general symptom of
which would be important to us, at least.
Yeah, I'd have a hard time having anybody woke on our program because I don't think they would like any of our commercials, unless we made fun of white people. Maybe I could come up with a few, but
well, if you want me to talk about the substance of the article and
yes, we definitely do,
as falling short. Well, let me quote the first paragraph. Maybe that'll get us rolling here. Systemic racism is both a theoretical concept and a reality. As a theory, it is premised on the research-supported claim that the United States was founded as a racist society, that racism is thus embedded in all social institutions, structures, and social relations within our society. Rooted in a racist foundation, systemic racism today is composed of intersecting, overlapping, and codependent racist institutions, policies, practices, ideas, and behaviors that give us an unjust amount of resources, rights, and power to white people while denying them to people of color. I think that's a pretty good summary of what she's trying to make the case. And then she gives 7 examples of ways in which racism is forms American society.
When you read the first statement, it's not only a theoretical concept but a reality. I'm thinking, well, all theoretical concepts are making claims about reality. So really, I think the subtext there is, don't just try to say this is just a theory. I'm telling you it's reality. Well, yeah, we assume if this is your theory, this is what you believe reality is like, but you're just begging the question with that statement.
Well, the question that she raises is an important one, and that is, why is it that people of different races in the United States have different experiences of life?
Mm-hmm.
For example, the income of European Americans in 2018 not per capita, but I think by the family was about $65,902. I don't know how many cents. Okay. And the family income of African Americans was a little less than 44,000. So almost 66,000 to almost 44,000. That's a pretty
Americans. Now do Asian Americans.
And also the gap in life expectancy. White Americans lived almost 79 years per person, or on average, whereas African Americans lived less than 75 years. So there was a gap, again, of a few years between European Americans and African Americans. So her argument is based basically on 2 premises, 2 pieces of evidence. The first piece of evidence for systemic racism is historical. And that's very clear in that first paragraph. And her second piece of evidence is the actual differences between the races, the difference of outcome between the races in America. Again, let me talk about that first premise or that first argument she makes first, and then it can maybe you can push the conversation whichever direction you want to go from there. Systemic racism is both a theoretical concept and a reality. As a theory, it is premised on the research-supported claim. Well, that's kind of a vague. I don't like that term, research-supported claim.
Yeah.
As a scholar myself, anything can be supported, but any claim can be supported by research if you wanted to. The United States was founded as a racist society that racism is thus embedded. Now look at these two verbs here: founded and embedded.
Embedded, yeah.
I don't know if either one of you gentlemen ever worked in construction.
Oh, I think somebody here has. There he is.
Okay.
Right there.
Okay. So what is a foundation?
Well, the foundation is what everything else is built on. You go down to solid clay, ground, whatever. You put on a foundation so that whatever you put in isn't going to move overly much. If it's a very tall building, let's say a skyscraper, you go down and find rock and you put in special foundations which actually allow movement of the building so it doesn't break apart in the wind. But you have to have a foundation to hold everything together that's going to be built upwards.
Yes, and I think that's probably a fundamental difference between houses in Washington State, where I live, and houses in Florida, where you live, Ron, is normally houses in Washington State, when a big wind comes along, the houses pretty much stay on their foundations, whereas in Florida, often they get up and travel around a little bit.
Well, I think that's more California, actually. I haven't seen, even in hurricanes, I haven't seen that happen. Trees now, that's another thing.
Trees, okay. So trees is the second metaphor that she uses. She says that, let's see what the word, she uses the word embedded. Racism is thus embedded in all social institutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, embedded gives you a picture of a plant being put in a flower bed or something like that. Now, I don't know, maybe one of you gentlemen is also a gardener.
Yeah, well, trees, for example, wherever the height of your tree, your root system goes on the ground that far, whatever the width of the branch, the leaf system, your roots underground go equally to that generally, and that's why the trees don't fall over in the wind.
Now, so there are some plants in the West called tumbleweeds that get around pretty well. You can see them, sometimes they stack up on the road and they even block roads sometimes. But most of my trees are pretty stationary. Now, this I would suggest that these two hidden metaphors are actually create a false analogy, or two false analogies. Because American society, or any society, is not like a house built on a foundation, and it's not like a tree planted in a garden, embedded in a garden. Because trees and houses don't get up and walk around. Right. They don't move from one place to another. But societies aren't like that. For example, if you could truthfully say that Greece was founded in a polytheistic religion.
Right.
It was. And then it became Christian. And then it became other things. Or you could say that Sweden was originally, founded in the belief in Odin and Thor and Loki and some of those other gods.
Yeah.
And then it became Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
It was founded in Catholicism, you could say. And then later on,
another
stage, Lutheranism and Pietism, and then secular humanism. So human beings aren't the same as trees or houses, because times change and society changes.
Yeah, societies aren't the same.
Yeah. And the same thing, of course, is true of the United States as well. And to give it a more focused consideration, if you look at the history of China, for example, China was founded, you could say, originally in some sort of a belief in the supreme God, and later on it became more polytheistic, and then later on Confucianism arose, and Taoism and Buddhism, and then down through the years up until the overthrow of Imperial China in 1911 or so. And then in 1949, Mao Zedong and his Red Army took over China, and Mao Zedong changed everything. And even the classes that were in power in China before that, landowners, for example, landowners no longer had any power in China. In fact, they were struggled against. They were the objects of persecution. They were put in prison. They lost everything, and even their children, even their grandchildren. And then in the Cultural Revolution, these people who once had power, they were the dregs of the earth. North Korea was even worse. Now they have a class society that's inverted from what it used to be. So,
but isn't that a classic Marxist line when you think about it? That you saw this in the Cultural Revolution. You're right. I mean, they completely took away power under Mao from the ruling class. But then 20 years later, Mao says, "Oh, we've still got counter-revolutionary forces at work. We've got to root them out." In other words, he was almost saying it's embedded in the culture, capitalism and inequality. So, what you were saying earlier, I was tracking. If I'm tracking with you, she went from making the argument it's founded, therefore it's embedded. Okay,
yes.
And now this raises the question that she never even asks. She just assumes that just because it's founded, therefore it's embedded in the culture. Is that true? Or if it's not, it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. But she never asks the question. She never investigates it. She never interrogates her own question.
No, she's fooled by her own metaphor.
Yeah.
And actually, this is a very common mistake to make. You see people appealing to American history and assuming casually that because American history has lots of racism in it, because Americans were slaves, some Americans were slaves and others were slave owners hundreds of years ago. And then you have redlining and you have racial discrimination and you have, all the conflicts that went on during the Grant administration and whatnot. Therefore, and then you have lynching in the early 1900s. Therefore, America is founded in racism, and this is a inherent quality of American society.
It's a recurring theme. It's a recurring theme. We have to grant that.
But I'm not saying that it's not.
No, I know.
America is not necessarily racist, but I'm saying that the argument is insufficient.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that until you prove that it was actually founded on racism, you're not making a logical point. You're making a rhetorical point.
Right.
You're simply making you're simply using language to persuade rather than to establish.
Well, I'm saying that the historical question is really not the most pressing question for today, anyway.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, it is. Maybe it's not the most pressing question, but it is an important question because the other premises follow from that.
Yeah.
And so the claim is it was founded on racism. When we look at it, though, if we actually know anything about history, we know that they were divided over the issue of slavery. It wasn't clear cut. Yeah, we all agree blacks are inferior, therefore they should be slaves. That just isn't really true. You had, prior to the founding of the nation, you had abolitionists at work in culture. When it was founded, you had abolitionists at work in culture trying to eliminate slavery. Slavery began in Africa as Africans captured other Africans and exported them out to other nations, including this geographical area in which we live, where 388,000 landed out of the 12 million who were sent across the waters. So was it founded on systemic racism, or was some of the population for slavery and other portions of the population opposed to slavery, and some compromise occurred to found the nation?
Well, I don't really think
more the case.
I don't really think the thing is, we use the word founded and we're thinking in concrete metaphors as if it were a house that were being built or a tree that were being planted. What exactly that means to be founded in is to me quite unclear. And I think it's supposed to be unclear to us. We can concede, I think, that there were a lot of that racism was a very important element in early American history, and that blacks were treated very unjustly.
Definitely.
We can concede all those things, but the error for me, the gravest error here, is to extrapolate from something that bad people did hundreds of years ago and blame people in the present for things that people who are no longer with us have done. That's the danger. But anyway, I'm not saying right now that her argument is necessarily wrong or that her conclusion is necessarily wrong. It may very well be that America continues to be systemically racist. My point is that logically, her argument doesn't follow. The fact that even if we say, whether we use the word founded, we use some other term, if we say, yeah, there was a lot of bad things that happened to American blacks in the past, generations ago, centuries ago, it wouldn't follow necessarily, her conclusion wouldn't follow from that. But that isn't really her strongest argument, according to her. She has another argument that she thinks is makes a stronger case for systemic racism, and which it's the one that I alluded to a few minutes ago. And let's see if I can find the original quote that she gives. Here is her. Oh, here we go. Cause effect. Oh, here it is. There is no more telling proof of the undeserved impoverishment of POC, people of color, and the undeserved enrichment of white people than the massive difference in the average wealth of white versus black and Latino families. So she says that this is her strongest argument for systemic racism, is the fact that black families and white families, they make different amounts of money. Also, at other points, she points out that life expectancy is different and other social outcomes is different between these two groups of people. Therefore, systemic racism is the best explanation. Really, this is very similar to Ibram Kendi's argument in, what is it? How to Be an Anti-Racist. He also, basically I would say there's three main explanations for this phenomenon. And Kendi and Cole, they basically base their argument on examining two of those alternatives and ignoring the third alternative, which is, in my view, the correct alternative. So maybe it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about those three alternatives.
Yes, that's important. I think we need to get to because just because they assert this is the reason doesn't mean this is the reason. Okay, we have an issue like, say, education. Why is it that blacks tend to be less educated than whites? Well, it has to do, in my opinion, with where they live. If they're in a Democrat enclave, they're likely going to be less educated in the public school system than if they live in white neighborhoods, because we take it more seriously than liberals do. But that's my opinion.
Well, this is an important question, not only because we're trying to assign blame and whether or not, say, other Americans should pay reparations to people whose ancestors were enslaved, but it's also important to figure out how to solve problems.
Right.
If we can figure out what the cause of the problem is, then it might be a little easier to figure out how to solve the problem. If we get the cause wrong, then we're going to get the solution wrong too. And we might actually exacerbate the problem rather than solving the problem.
Yep, I agree with that.
So, do you want me to go over the three alternatives and discuss?
I do, but we should hear from our sponsor just quickly in advance, because they too are trying to solve a problem for folks.
Yeah, so let me get that up here, because I apologize. I haven't been looking at the clock. Okay, recently in an emergency meeting at the Toxico Corporation, project lead Stu said, these protests are delaying the project and killing our bottom line. Larry, the foreman, said, all this over a few million dead fish. And so PR spokesperson Pam said, yeah, we're the real victims here. Meanwhile, across town, a hedge fund manager consults with his lawyer and says, I feel so left out of the culture wars. I can't afford to be left behind. But where do I find the right victim status to bring me the professional success I'm looking for? Meanwhile, Phil is meeting with his career counselor. I've come to the point where I realize I don't have enough intersectionality on my resume. Do you think I should consider gender reassignment surgery to boost my job prospects? Well, now there's a solution for all these problems. The grievance industrial complex. At the grievance industrial process, you'll find the premier manufacturer and recycler of fine grievance products. They provide grievances that are customized for your political, economic, and social goals. And they work closely with you throughout the design and implementation process to ensure your satisfaction. Every grievance industrial complex product comes with their patented moral high ground, which gives you victim status, your own identity politics tactics, flawless far left ideology, and so much more. And free for a limited time, you get playing the victim card for terrorists, which is even better than the Harry Potter series, according to Dr. S.J.W. Jones, the grievance industrial complex, because things are never bad enough already. So you need to get that. Tune in for more information.
For more information, and there you have it. Okay, so what are the three areas that you wanted to wax eloquent upon?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to wax eloquent or not, but just maybe there's some alternative that I haven't thought of, and people can suggest those but these are pretty broad, so they probably cover most of the alternatives. The first possible explanation for disparities among races, and let me point something out. First of all, this does not just include America. This is true around the world. Wherever you have people who are different from one another in some ways, you'll have some sorts of disparities. And secondly, so we're trying to explain something that's broader than just America.
Right.
The first possibility is race. Maybe it's the human race itself that makes the difference. Maybe some races of people are inherently superior to others, or at least in some ways. Now, it's possible that some people listening to this podcast may think that. That viewpoint is generally what we consider racist, explaining differences between human beings as inferiority or superiority by skin color or by genetic extraction, or whatever you want to say. There's a few different reasons to not believe the racist explanation for the disparities. First, of course, is social. If you are a racist, well, you're doomed in modern American society. You're going to be outcast. You're going to be considered beneath contempt. To be a racist is the worst possible thing in American society, and it will ruin your life. So that's a practical social reason to discard the racist explanation. The second one is
that first one, though. Doesn't that kind of belie the whole systemic idea?
Well, I'm talking about explanations for disparities between races. If you think the explanation lies in pigmentation or in genetics, then that is by definition a racist explanation. You think that the races themselves are so different from one another. So we're not necessarily talking about systemic racism here. We're talking about classical racism.
Okay.
The second reason not to accept this explanation is theological. In the beginning, God created male and female, Adam and Eve, and according to the Bible, we all come from one family.
Right.
This is repeated over and over again throughout the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament we have, of course, one of the early Christians is Philip, I believe it is specifically sent to an Ethiopian to preach the gospel to him, and one of the other apostles, I believe it was Thomas. Yes, according to tradition, he went to India and preached the gospel in India. So,
right.
Jesus said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all people. God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that everyone who believes will have faith in Christ and will be saved." So, from a Christian perspective, you might be able to find a few verses and twist them and say, "Well, no, the races are really quite different." But I think the best form this debate took was the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, when Harriet Beecher Stowe, basically, it's a bad novel, some would say, but it's a good theological debate. And Harriet Beecher Stowe is actually debating the question of whether or not the Bible supports slavery and racism. and especially slavery. And she comes to the conclusion that no, it doesn't. And I think her arguments are pretty good. The third reason to reject the racist solution is biological. Human beings, according to biologists, we are very closely related, even from a biological point of view. We went through a bottleneck, several, maybe tens of thousands of years ago. So unlike most species, human beings have not had enough time to evolve huge differences among us. Oh, there are differences of skin color and height and things like that. But in terms of mental faculties, it's very unlikely that human beings would evolve huge differences in such a short amount of time. The fourth reason is economic. Now, it's true that African Americans in general have lower income than European Americans in general, and both have much lower income than Asian Americans. But Nigerian Americans do much better than the average in America, for example. And finally, probably the most important reason to reject the racist interpretation of the data is, I would say, there's a better explanation for it, which I'll get to in a little bit. So that's the first explanation, which not that many Americans hold to, I don't think, anymore, but that is traditionally and historically very important. The idea that some races are inherently superior and other races are inherently inferior. And I think Christianity is pretty much opposed to that perspective. Should I go on to the second point? The second solution,
yeah, absolutely.
Which is Ms. Cole's solution, and that is racism is the reason why there's such huge disparities. The first problem with the racism solution to this question, is one I've already mentioned or hinted at already, and that is Asian Americans, by almost every measure, do much better than European Americans. They have much higher incomes. In fact, the group of people that has the highest income, the race that has the highest income in America, is Indian Americans, well above anybody else.
Wow.
Indian Americans not only have a very high income, they also have a lot of power. I mean, the Vice President of the United States, for example, is half Indian American. The president of Microsoft, president of lots of the major tech corporations, and many, the leader of the progressive caucus in the House of Representatives is from Chennai, India. It's just simply not true that people who are people of color, so-called people of color in America, necessarily have bad outcomes in the United States. Now, 6% of Americans are Asian Americans. We can't just ignore those people, which Cole does. She never once mentions in the whole article, she never mentions Asians or Asians Americans. My wife is Japanese. My kids are half Japanese. They have dual citizenship. They have both passports. I find it rather ludicrous that Ms. Cole ignores Asians, and I think she does it deliberately.
Oh, yeah.
It ruins her argument.
It does.
Secondly, in fact, if you look at the policies for school entry at major American universities, they favor Hispanics and African Americans over European Americans and Asian Americans. You need a higher SAT score, you need higher grades if you have this devilish white skin or more yellowish skin or whatever. If you don't have the right skin color, you simply need a higher scores in order to get into elite American universities. And this is why at the University of Washington, for example, the only major ethnic group that is underrepresented at my university where I went to school and got my BA and MA, one of the world's leading research universities, is European Americans. Every other major group is pretty close to average or above average in terms of representation, but European Americans are underrepresented among the student body. This is pretty much universal in the United States. If you are African American or Hispanic American, you have an advantage in entry and getting into the best schools. There's just no question about that. And thirdly, it's also true that there are a lot of very good jobs that you will get you'll more likely get if you have the requisite skin color, and it's not a white skin color. This has become pretty obvious when Joe Biden was choosing his vice president,
Right.
and his first Supreme Court nominee, because he explicitly said so. I'm choosing this person because they have, black skin, because they have this background. But it's not just the White House. There's a lot of tech corporations. In fact, let me read a quote from a professor at Georgetown University, which makes his own experience very explicit. This is from Georgetown professor John Hassness. He said, "In the more than 20 years that I have been a professor at Georgetown University, I have been involved in many faculty searches. Every one begins with a strong exhortation from the administration to recruit more women and minority professors. We are explicitly reminded that every search is a diversity search. Administrators require submission of a plan to vigorously recruit applicants from women and minority candidates. Before we even begin our selection, we must receive approval from the provost that our outreach efforts have been vigorous enough. The deans and deputy deans of each school reinforce the message that no expense should be spared to increase the genetic diversity of our faculty." Now, if you look online, you look on some of the web pages for the department. I was just looking for another reason, a completely random reason. I was looking at a oceanography web page for my university. I wanted to contact some oceanographers for some reason, and two of the oceanographers that I checked out of 4 also had a diversity statement mentioning their strong desire to recruit more people of color. There were several Chinese in that department, but there was only one African American out of about 100 in the department. They wanted to have more African Americans or Hispanics in their department, and they made it very clear that that was part of their goal. So it's simply not true that systemic racism is likely to be the strongest barrier against people who are trying to find jobs. And in a lot of workplaces and a lot of tech organizations and whatnot, there's a very strong desire to make their workforce more diverse, to recruit African American and Hispanic people in those fields. So the question arises then, why have they been unsuccessful? Why is it that
Right.
oceanography department only has 1 black and 3 Chinese out of almost 100 oceanographers, or people who teach in the oceanography department?
Supply doesn't meet demand, maybe?
Well, that may be, and that probably is, but I think we need to tease that out a little bit, and I want to tease it out in terms of a third explanation, which I think is the true explanation for all these differences. The difference in wages, the differences in savings, the differences in health outcome. Let's begin with the health outcome. You guys are from the Midwest, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So do you eat very much Asian food?
What's that?
I don't.
I've been exposed to it. Well,
exposed to it. You make it sound like it's some sort of a.
Yeah. Well, Todd, come on. We've all been near, chop suey. Chinese. Everybody's had grown up on chop suey that you send out.
Yeah, China chop suey. Yeah, right. Okay. Well, let me put it this way. There's an anomalous statistic when it comes to life expectancy, and that is, it appears that Hispanic Americans live a few years longer than European Americans.
Okay.
Whereas most of the statistics seem to go the other way. Whites make more money than Hispanics. There's a higher murder rate in the Hispanic community, but for some reason, Hispanic Americans seem to live a few years longer. And I honestly don't know the answer to that question, but I think I can figure out why Asian Americans live much longer than anybody else. Here's the statistics. Black Americans, 74.5 years. White Americans, 78.7 years. Hispanics, 81.8 years. And Asian Americans, get ready for this.
Okay.
87 years.
Whoa.
87 years.
Wow.
Now, obviously, America is a racist society run by Asian Americans.
I
That's, according to Ibram Kendi, that's the only thing that can explain this set of.
don't know. You seem to have hit on something that nobody else has discovered that explains everything. Yeah.
Yeah. And here's the other thing. The NBA is obviously run by racist African Americans. That's why the vast majority of NBA forwards, guards, and centers are African American.
And so LeBron James is just fooling everybody when he says the players are being treated like slaves. Then I've never met multimillionaire slaves before, but
yeah, well, there were in the Arabian era. There were some pretty rich Arab slaves. So maybe
interesting.
Okay, so the point, of course, is that the explanation of racism, there's lots of holes in that explanation. It doesn't really seem to explain a lot of the evidence that we see. Now, some people would say the reason that Asian Americans do better than European Americans is because they're selective immigrants. These are from the elite of those countries. Same thing with Nigerians. These are the elite. These are doctors. These are people with, with master's degrees, PhDs. They're in the tech field or something like that, and that's true. But that really wouldn't work for Hispanics and why they live longer. Well, here's a simple reason why. But here's a sociologist. I understand sociologists not understanding history. Okay, that's understandable. Sociologists not traveling and not understanding other languages, not living in other societies. I kind of understand that too. But probably most sociologists eat. One would think.
I would think so. Yeah.
I think I put money on that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And this is the obvious explanation for different disparate life expectancies. Is people eat different things. If you eat Japanese food, I eat a lot of Japanese food because my wife is Japanese. It's more healthy than Fritos or fried. Well, we had fried chicken last night, but that's okay. Fritos
once in a while.
Yeah, once in a while. Japanese food is pretty healthy food. East Asian food in general is healthy. I don't know South Asian food quite as well, but this is one of the reasons why not just Asian Americans, but Asians as well, East Asians, have a much longer life expectancy than Americans in general. Japanese, Taiwanese, Koreans, and now even Shanghai has a higher life expectancy than any major American city.
So does this mean that the fact that we sent McDonald's over there is a racist attempt to poison them?
I can tell you stories about McDonald's in Shanghai. I actually was feeding some prostitutes McDonald's hamburgers on the street. Well, that's and then the Chinese got mad at me for being too nice to people. Anyway, most of those people were from outside of the city. Life expectancy has increased in East Asia pretty dramatically. And the main reason for that is, one reason for that is risk avoidance. East Asian cultures, these are people who grew up in, most of them are rice growing, and you have the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China is a risk avoidance mechanism.
Yeah.
You want to protect your crops from the Mongols. Now, the Mongols have a totally different outlook on life. They're studying the wolves, right? That's what they say. They're saying we're learning from the wolves how to fight, and that's why we fight so well. Well, they did fight well, but these two cultures had fundamentally different mindsets. And East Asian culture, I can't speak so well for South Asian culture, but it's probably similar, is essentially a risk avoidance culture. Therefore, this is one of the explanations for how they treated COVID as well, and why they mask up so much, and why they are still going a little crazy about Omicron in mainland China, is because they're avoiding risk. Well, you have the farming culture, which is essentially a risk avoidance culture, and you have the nomadic people culture and the tribal culture, which is much more macho. Now apply that to American subcultures, and you can explain a lot of the differences in life expectancy. You have, what is now, according to John McWhorter, about 20% of African Americans are basically in the ghetto culture. So that means it's 80% that are not in the ghetto culture. Let me talk about those for a few minutes. Diet, okay, life expectancy, diet. Here's another factor that's important. Marriage. Back 100 years ago, African-American marriage rates were very high, and most families stuck together. But then the African-American family and then the white family started to fall apart to the point where even now even 40% or more of white children are born out of wedlock. According to Heather McDonald, this is a cultural explanation. All these things are cultural explanations. Heather McDonald says, one of the reasons why there's so much gang violence, one of the reasons why there's so much murder in the inner city is because of family breakdown. Kids come home and they are raised by their mothers, but they need their fathers. Sociologically, I think this sociologist should know this. And this is a funny thing about Ibram Kendi. He kind of admits this about his own family, but he forgets it about everybody else's family. He says, I did my PhD, and I don't think I would have stuck with it if my parents hadn't made me study when I came home.
Right.
But then he forgets that about culture, his culture in general, is that lack of a father in the family is going to have an impact on how kids behave when they come home. Because, they'll listen to their mom sometimes, but sometimes they won't. They really need a father figure. That seems to be a sociological fact psychological fact about human minds for some reason. It's not fair to the mothers who are doing all that work to raise their kids. But this is one of the explanations, which is a cultural explanation.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to interrupt there for a moment because the blog we did last week was on the lost art of fathering.
By the way, this is the article we're talking about for people listening.
Yeah, and we point out that some statistics. Currently, 25% of children across all ethnicities are being raised without a father in the home. But that nearly triples with African Americans. So then we quote from something, African American Family Structure, which tells us this. In the Harlem neighborhood of New York in 1925, 85% of kin-related black households had two parents. When Moynihan warned in his 1965 report that the coming destruction of the black family, however, the out-of-wedlock birth rate had increased to 25% among the black population. This figure continued to rise over time, and in 1991, 68% of black children were born outside of marriage. U.S. Census data from 2010 revealed that more American families consisted of single mothers than married households with both parents. In 2011, it reported that 72% of black babies were born to unmarried mothers. As of 2015, at 77.3%, black families have the highest rate of non-marital births among Native Americans. So they've gone from under 25% in less than 100 years to 77% of blacks being raised in single-family homes. That's tragic.
Well, here's the main thought I've been having throughout all this, especially as I'm listening to you, David, is you are doing a very deep dive into the complex issues, and our society today has an extremely limited appetite for complexity, for details, and therefore for analysis. I'm going to I hope this is a helpful illustration. Back in the 80s, one time I was really getting into classical music. Now, I like all kinds of music. I love all kinds of music, rock and roll, you name it. But I was really starting to appreciate the complexity and the brilliance of so much classical music, as I was learning more about it. And not just classical, but symphonic music going well into the 20th century, Gershwin and all that. Amazing stuff that came out of these composers and amazing arrangements and all that. I was looking for a very particular title. I think it was a Mozart piece. And I walked into this is back when you had to get everything still on either CDs or LPs. CDs were relatively new. I walk into this good record store and I'm looking for this title. And they say, oh, I got to go get the manager. The manager comes out and he's wearing a Guns N' Roses hat. Okay. My first thought is I'm doomed. this guy is not going to know anything. Well, it turns out he knew exactly. He was extremely knowledgeable in classical music. He took me right to what I was looking for. And I go, I never would have dreamed that you had any ability to find this disc for me based on the Hatcher ring. He laughed. He goes, yeah, that's just what's selling now, right? Simple, simple music sell, simple ideas sell, sound bites sell. Remember that time, Don, you hauled me in right after you got me to show up at a house for an interview on the local Fox affiliate after the Hale Bop suicides, the Heaven's Gate cult, and they sat me down. They asked me questions, and I talked and talked. Then they sent me outside, and you came out and they said they didn't find what they were looking for. So could you try it one more time? And I went back in. I sat down. I talked and talked. You came back out, and finally you said, they're just looking for a sound bite. They're just looking for a couple of words.
Right.
I go, okay, I can do that. They wanted. It's like simplicity. Nobody has time or patience. We've raised up a generation that has rendered itself incapable of the kind of analysis you're doing, or they can't even deal with it, David. They can't even listen to it now. They want something. This is racist. That's racist. I was surprised to see the article that you're analyzing very well has almost 1,600 words in it. I mean, most of this is propaganda, and most of this
is propaganda, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to tackle it. You're right.
Yeah.
Most of the not most.
It has 1,600 words, but not 1,600 distinct words.
Okay, that is true.
Most of them are either racist or
what? We could probably do an analysis and only come up with like 200 words in the whole thing,
a
right?
certain amount of the population, and I don't know if it's large, small, or whatever, it probably under a certain age group tends to get all of their information in 128 character sound bites. Let's call them tweets. And if it's longer than that, it's too much for them to really consider. So, what David is doing here is important because it's going, okay, we acknowledge that there's issues between the various ethnicities, color ranges of humanity, I really like the color ranges of humanity, the different cultural styles, Japanese, and I remember as a youngster, there was one thing that really held our nation together in a kind of an interesting way that we don't have as much today. You could go in Chicago and you would have the Polish neighborhood, the Italian neighborhood, the black neighborhood, the Ukrainian neighborhood, the Chinese neighborhood, and every one of them were Americans.
Yeah.
We don't really have that today. No. You're divided by color and you remain divided by color. You have no commonalities. How did that happen?
Democrats. I'm just kidding.
Well, I remember visiting a seminary in Yunnan province in China, where COVID virus supposedly came from. And I remember it was a minority seminary. Because Yunnan supposedly has 28 minorities. And this is a seminary that was a lot of them were Christians. Some of them were Christians. And I remember one of them saying, they stood up and greeted us and said hi. And one of them said, we don't have culture, which meant we don't have a writing system, in other words. They'd kind of accepted some of the dominant culture's ideas of them in a kind of a negative way. Now, maybe among themselves, they said something very differently. Walking around Taiwan, I remember I was walking through a Ataya village, which is a Polynesian minority group that lives in the mountains. And it might have been Ame. And some drunk guy came up to me and he punched me for no particular reason. And I kind of backed off. And there's a lot of the Taiwanese would focus on the negative side of the differences between the cultures in Taiwan. And they would say, these guys are prone to drink. They're prone to, other problems, other social problems. And that was true. But there are also aspects of the tribal cultures that I really appreciated. And I thought, this is part of what the Taiwanese people need too, and they appreciate it too. Not just the fact that they're really good musicians or sports figures, things like that, but there's a sincerity among them and a kind of if your tribal person went up in the mountains and got lost, well, he wouldn't get lost, first of all. But if he did, he'd find things to eat. He'd know which fruit you could pick off the tree and make a soap out of. If you're typical lowland Chinese hiked in the mountains, he'd get lost. He was dead, he was doomed. So cultures are different, but like you said, we should appreciate the differences. And it's not, you shouldn't typecast people because of their culture either. Right. Of course, that would be, it's not necessarily racism, but a culturalism, because people are not reduced to, their ancestry or their family or anything like that. But we should appreciate the families. So one thing I do with my students is I ask them to, introduce some of the foods that their family really likes, and tell us, tell us a little bit about their tradition and whatnot, because my students are from around the world. And that's a lot of fun. Anyway, back to the reasons why cultural is a better explanation for these differences. Let me add another one. John McWhorter, who is an African-American linguist and really smart guy.
Oh, yeah. But
I don't agree with him about some things. He's a little bit off on some issues.
He's an atheist too.
He buys into the Enlightenment myth of how the West started to progress. He's completely wrong about that, but he's got a lot of interesting insights, and he's very good in languages. Anyway, in his Losing the Race, he described 3 things that he felt was holding his fellow African Americans back, and they all had to do with culture. He called them myths, or cults rather. First of all, the cult of victimology. Secondly, the cult of separatism. And thirdly, the cult of anti-intellectualism. And the idea was his students felt, even if they're very smart students, they're from middle-class backgrounds, they're well off, their parents have money, they're coming into his school, which was UC Berkeley at the time. Some of them, a lot of them, felt like if you really studied, if you really fell in love with what you're studying, which is necessary to get ahead in the academic world, to really love it, to be obsessed with it. That's acting white. And the thing is about some of these, about Ms. Cole's article and about some of the other propaganda on the woke side of the spectrum, it's very, very self-defeating.
Yeah.
If you're going to blame the whites, that's the cult of victimization. If you're going to blame other people for your success or failure, if you're going to take serious love of, say, oceanography, for example, as a failure of some kind, as a betrayal of some kind, you're cutting yourself, you're destroying your own chances. Now notice, here's another reason why culture is a better explanation for success. Jewish people in Europe, okay, I just say that much. Jewish people in Europe, they were persecuted for hundreds of years. And they come out of that winning Nobel Prizes right and left. A huge percentage of Nobel Prizes have gone to Jewish scientists and other scholars. So if there is that love of learning, if you want to say embedded within the culture, and here we can actually talk about a tree growing. It's not a bad metaphor necessarily when you're talking about family relationships. And, if you have that growing within your culture, then you can defeat prejudice. You can overcome it. And you don't need reparations and you don't need anything else to do it. If it's even very much more harsher than it was until, it wasn't America against Black people in the 20th century. It was much worse for Jews for a very long time in Europe and in other parts of the world. And yet they overcame that. Now, I think somebody like Booker T. Washington understood that. And I think his ideas about the importance of education really made a difference for a lot of African Americans for a long time. And, leaning into those ideas, leaning into the most successful and the most creative, helpful sorts of ideas, because culture derives from ideas. all our cultures, what we eat. If you're a vegetarian, you eat some foods, and you're a vegetarian because you believe that, in reincarnation, for example, you might be a vegetarian for that reason. That's going to influence how you eat. It's going to influence how you study. It's going to influence how you live. Ideas are where culture comes from. So I think that at the very heart of this, the real reason for differences is how people live and how people see themselves. And first of all, what people think about the world. Now, not all those differences are necessarily good or bad. I don't like to just say everything is, black and white in that sense, because I think every culture has things within it that can benefit the rest of us. So, but anyway, my main point.
Okay, go ahead. Your main point.
My main point is, I think culture is a vastly better explanation for the differences between outcomes in the United States than either race or racism is.
And I would agree with that. I think when you assess a problem, which is what we're talking about here, there's a variety of solutions. What solution most adequately answers how to fix the problem? So, and I don't find that those in wokeism tend to look at that question. They just assume victimization is the answer. And then try to work to say we need to reduce victimization. And we do that by blaming everything on white guys. And so we have to somehow get them out of the mix.
Well, they can blame it on white people as long as they don't blame it on bald people. Now, that would be really
That's where I draw the line myself.
Yeah. But unfortunately, because I see some different kinds of things as you do, I work with people of all kinds of ethnicities and have pretty much all of my life. And the thing that I find that seems to work in the lives of those who excel is they don't see themselves as victims. They figure out ways to advance their lives, whether it's education, diet, whatever it is. They are taking responsibility for where they go from here, regardless of what the past was. Whereas those who see themselves as victims stay continually in victimhood and don't advance. Now, what's the answer to that? I think it is culture. I think it is mentality. I think if you are told repeatedly you cannot advance, you have no control of your life, somebody else has control of your life, and we have to fix that somebody else to relinquish control so you can advance, you will see yourself as a victim. And if you see yourself as a victim, you just have no way out.
And maybe here is where the apologetic sides of things comes in, because the most important idea when it comes to changing culture and changing our mindset is faith in God.
Yes.
If we trust God, then He's the one who rewards and punishes.
Right. And His Word also tells us how to treat one another, regardless of ethnicity, is to serve one another, to love one another, to do the best for each other, to think the best of each other, to forgive as we have been forgiven, to not hold one another responsible for acts or actions committed by somebody else in history in time past. That is just not helpful. So, and with that, we are going to end today. And I thank you for being part of.
Thank you.
Of this discussion. It's an important one. It's not nearly as fun as a lot of the things that we like to do, but it's an important one because I think it's the actual issue is unfortunately, or the cause of the issue is unfortunately missed, maybe by both sides in some ways. So I think you've done a great job and a good service to us. Thank you, sir. Ron, would you care to waltz us out of here?
I would care to do that. Let's give credit to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and The Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polygamus. Our liberal Official Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys. Oh, the humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Shirley Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murphy Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Grievance Resolution Director is Giovanna Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance is Larry Tipping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc., in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never happen. And for those who do join us regularly, I want to let them know that next week we will not be online. We are actually taking a day off.
We're getting a break here.
We're getting a break here because Ron wants to go swimming by the palm trees.
Yeah. Well, now that we've gotten the algae out of the pool, yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. Adios, everybody.